welcome to the University of Montana's celebration of Constitution Day. Constitution Day, as some of you know, is on September 17th, and we're required by federal law since we receive federal funds, to provide educational programming on that day, but we're going for what the lawyers would call substantial compliance. This is close enough for government work. That requirement dates back to 2005 when Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia attached an amendment to an enormous appropriations bill that required the federal government and every educational institution to provide, quote, education and training about the Constitution on September 17th, the date the Constitution was ratified. I gotta say, I'm not all that crazy about having the federal government dictate the subject of what we should teach and when we should teach it, although we don't want to lose our federal funding. And given the fact that Byrd introduced it, I also prefer to take my constitutional instruction, at least in general terms, for someone who didn't belong to the Ku Klux Klan. But still, whatever the provenance of the requirement, the American Constitution certainly is worth contemplating and worth celebrating. The great British statesman William Gladstone described the American Constitution as, quote, the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. Our Constitution is over 200 years old, which makes it, by a long shot, the oldest written Constitution still in effect. And it's difficult to read the Constitution without being struck by the extent to which it is an 18th century document. And yet, for all of its 18th century characteristics, it remains functioning and relevant. It's been amended only infrequently, 27 times. And the first 10 amendments were adopted at the time of the Constitution, so they probably shouldn't even count. And 3 of those remaining amendments were passed after the Civil War. And one reason for its longevity is that the Constitution is itself adaptable. It provides for its own amendment, although it makes it difficult to do so. But I think most important, it's a general statement of principles. It's a document of less than 8,000 words. It was intended to be no more than a general outline. If it had been excessively detailed, it could hardly survive the stress of 2 centuries during which the United States evolved from 13 states huddled on the eastern coast to a nation that spanned a continent and became a global power. So even if some of you may join me in objecting to the feds telling us what and when to teach, the Constitution is worth talking about. And that brings us to tonight's event. First, I'd like to thank the Provost Office, which provided funding, staff assistance, and thank the Dean of the Law School, Paul Kurgis, for funding, and thanks to Rob Saldin. Rob, are you here? Oh, there you are. Thanks to Rob of the Political Science Department and Anthony Johnstone of the Law School for their support and efforts in organizing the event, and a special thanks to Rob for finding funding, without which this event could not have taken place. Tonight we have, as our speaker, a distinguished scholar of the American Constitution, Michael Zuckert. Is it pronounced Drew, really? The Nancy Drew? The Nancy Drew Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, and perhaps an even more important credential, he's a friend of my colleague, Linda Fry. After completing his PhD at the University of Chicago, he taught at Carleton College, and since 1998 at Notre Dame. He's held visiting professorships at Claremont Men's College, as it was called in those days, Cornell University, University of Michigan, Fordham University, and the University of Chicago. He's a widely respected authority in the fields of constitutional law and political theory. He's written numerous books and countless articles in those fields. Actually, they're not countless. I just didn't bother to count them. They're about 2.5 pages on his resume. He published a book called Natural Rights and the New Republicanism in 1994, which makes a compelling case that natural rights liberalism is the key to understanding the founding of the American Republic. 2 years later, he published the Natural Rights Republic, and that was followed by launching Liberalism, John Locke, and the Liberal Tradition. More recently, he's published with Catherine Zuckert 2 books on Leo Strauss. Of the second book, David Lewis Schaefer wrote that of all the published studies of Strauss who have appeared thus far, the Zuckert's is simply the best. that says it all. So I'll halt there and ask you to please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Michael Zuk.
I should start by saying that David Schaefer is an old friend, so take that for what it's worth for his recommendation. And Mike, thanks very much for that introduction, and also for covering a lot of the ground that, about Constitution Day. I don't have much left to say, but fortunately, actually, I was planning to speak not so much about the founders, although I'll come to them, but to start actually with Abraham Lincoln, who I think has something to say not merely relevant to understanding the Constitution and at least thinking about the Constitution, which is, I take it, what Senator Byrd really wanted us to do on Constitution Day, rather than to be indoctrinated about it. But I think what Lincoln has to offer us is not merely some insights into the Constitution or the way constitutionalism works in America, but also into some of the issues of our own time, which I'm going to come to a little bit towards the end of my talk, but hang on, they're there. So let me begin by mentioning the fact that what I want to talk about is a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave, or start there, I should say, a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave when he was not quite 30 years old, that he wasn't much older than a lot of the undergraduates here, and hardly almost the same as my introducer. This was given in 1838, just at the end of the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And you may remember that Jackson was actually quite a controversial president, known at the time for his strong use, and many would say a strong abuse, of presidential powers. One of the things that he's remembered for as president was the so-called Trail of Tears, the forced evacuation of the Native Americans from the southeast into the west. And Lincoln, in 1838, when he delivered this speech, was a member of the Whig political party, a now defunct political party, but a party that had been formed actually during the time of Jackson to oppose Jackson. It was its agenda was not quite entirely, but was very strongly anti-Jackson. And in this speech, which is called On the Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions, it's a speech that Lincoln gave at something called the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, where he was living at that time. These lyceums were like boosterist organizations that existed in many towns in what was then called the West. And they were devoted to, people would come and give speeches, and there was a sort of general devotion to boosterism with regard to their area and their town, but also to self-improvement of the young people in the community. So they were very high-minded kind of things that Senator Byrd probably would have approved of, I think. In any case, in this speech, Lincoln raised the question, is there reason to worry about the perpetuation of our political institutions? And interestingly, he started the speech by outlining how fine everything seemed in America, that the country was prosperous, there were no dangers or threats or obvious threats on the horizon, there were no problems with foreign countries and so on. Despite that beginning, he concluded, though, that there was a ground for concern. Turned out that that ground for concern was not Andrew Jackson per se, because Jackson was no longer president. He had been out of office for a year. It was not the issue of slavery even, which in the late 1830s had not yet become the kind of really contentious issue that it became very soon thereafter. And it was not foreign danger of any sort. Lincoln dismissed all of those very early in the speech. What he was concerned about, though, was the presence of mobs, or more particularly of mob violence. He thought that through their direct and indirect effects, these mobs constituted the greatest threat to the perpetuation of American republicanism, constitutionalism. As he described them, they were not the product or growth of any particular region or section of the country. He saw them popping up more or less everywhere. Likewise, he said, they were not particularly connected to the slave part of America or to the free part of America, although it turns out that the examples that he dwells on the most in this speech were all from the slave part of America, especially Mississippi and Missouri. The two examples that he uses from those two places he describes this way. These two are perhaps, he said, the most dangerous in example and the most revolting to humanity. Strong language. One kind of worry that he had is especially visible in the Mississippi example that he speaks of, where first, as he describes it, the mob took off after gamblers who had been recently licensed in the state of Mississippi to practice their trade. Then they took off after Negroes, he said, who were caught and hanged in all parts of the state. Then the mob went after white men who were supposedly allied with the Negroes. And finally, just about any unfamiliar individual that the mob came across, until dead men, he said, were hanging from trees upon every roadside. So what Lincoln seems to see here is that mob violence spawns mob violence, or that he's concerned with, we might call, the contagion of violence. He gives another example, this one from Missouri. This involved an individual named McIntosh, who was a man of mixed race, whose fate Lincoln describes as follows: it was the most highly tragic of anything of its length that has ever been witnessed in real life. Strong statement again. McIntosh, he tells us, was seized by the mob, chained to a tree, and burned alive. All of this took place, he tells us, within a single hour from the time he had been a freeman, attending to his own business and at peace with the world. So these two examples, I think, display cruelty, arbitrariness, injustice that accompanies mob action. These were the kind of concerns that Lincoln raised as the most obvious surface effects of mob action. But almost strange to say, he believed that this direct effect of mob action was not the main danger that mobs provided. In fact, somewhat shockingly, I think, when one reads his speech, Lincoln almost dismisses the direct effects as being of importance at all. Listen to what he says. Abstractly considered, he says, the hanging of the gamblers was of but little consequence. They constitute a portion of the population that is worse than useless in any community. Their loss is never a matter of reasonable regret with anyone. Similar to, he tells us, is the correct reasoning in regard to the burning of the Negro at St. Louis. He had forfeited his life by the perpetration of an outrageous murder. There's a fact he had sort of omitted the first time around. And had he not died as he did, he must have died by the sentence of the law in a very short time afterward. So Lincoln really is belittling the direct effects of what the mobs did in order to highlight what he considers the more dangerous indirect effects. So just as there is a kind of contagion or expansive power to the violence perpetrated by the mobs themselves, so it turns out there is an expansion of lawlessness from the original perpetrators of the lawlessness to other sorts of persons in the community. This was where his worry mainly lay. As he put it, the mobs, by their example, encourage a group of people he calls the lawless in spirit to become lawless in practice. This group, these lawless in spirit, they have no attachment to the law or to justice themselves. Rather, they accept the restraints of the law only because they dread the punishment that may follow from not respecting the law. Seeing the mobs go unpunished, though, these lawless in spirit folks lose their dread and act out as their hearts have always desired. Indeed, as Lincoln tells us, they pray for nothing as much as the total annihilation of government. Now, from the lawless in spirit, the contagion spreads to good men. Men, he says, who love tranquility, who desire to abide by the laws and enjoy their benefits. Experiencing the breakdown of the laws, these individuals, who Lincoln identifies as the strongest bulwark of any government, they become tired and disgusted with a government that offers them insufficient protection of their lives, their families, their property. And these men then lose their attachment to the government. So these people, the ordinary law-abiding citizens, then become open to experiments in governance led by strong men who promise them more peace and security than what's on offer in the Republic. So Lincoln has outlined a path along which danger to the perpetuation of American political institutions lies. The mobs encourage the lawless in spirit to violate the law, which in turn leads to the disaffection of the lawless in spirit, which in turn leads I'll get it straight here. First we have the mobs, then we have the lawless in spirit who become lawless in practice, and then we have the good people, the ordinary people who are lawful in spirit, whose yearning for order and security through more effective government makes them, also disaffects them from the government as well. Now this analysis, in my opinion at least, is plausible and seems to me a good fit for some of the 20th century movements that we saw in, say, Italy or Germany in the 1930s, and perhaps we could identify such movements today nearer at hand. But one aspect of his analysis, I think, should make us sit up and take notice. This is often overlooked in this speech, but I think it's very important, very important. The original mobs of which he speaks are not the same persons that he refers to as the lawless in spirit. These latter people, the lawless in spirit, are liberated to their lawlessness by the mob violence, but they're not at all the same as the mobs. The mobs that Lincoln is concerned with here are not the same as the mobs we might be inclined to identify with normal rioters or looters or people like that, who become lawless in practice when they loot like big box stores and walk out with 75-inch LED screen televisions. These are not the people Lincoln is thinking about when he's thinking about mobs. His mobs, the mobs he's concerned with, as he puts it, they share a growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of courts, and the worse than savage mobs for the executive ministers of justice. His mobs, in other words, are not common looters, but groups who act in the name of and to effectuate justice. They are groups who take the law into their own hands and who believe they are serving justice in place of and better than the ordinary officers of the law. His primary concern is with that kind of action that he calls mob law. That is, mobs whose action substitutes for the regular and proper legal actions by regular and proper governmental officials, acting in place of courts, acting in place of executive authorities. Now that observation that Lincoln is thinking of these mobs as taking the place of or trying to act in place of the lawful authorities gives some insight into the scope of the problem that Lincoln had in mind, but also a suspicion of what might be the most likely cause of this phenomenon. Now in America, the idea of the people exercising political power is not really so strange. Indeed, we might say it is even the official doctrine of the nation. For in America, we think of our governance system as one based on popular sovereignty. That is to say, on the idea that the source of all governmental power is the people, and that the ultimate possessors of political power are the people. Isn't this what the Declaration of Independence means when it pronounces all men to be created equal, and that the source of legitimate government authority is consent of the governed? That's a sort of affirmation of this idea of popular sovereignty. But if a dominant part of the American conception of government under the Revolution, if not from before the Revolution, is popular sovereignty, then why, Lincoln's speech sort of implies, if it doesn't raise it directly, why is it that now, 1838, quite a few years after the Declaration of Independence, this problem is sort of showing itself in a way that it doesn't appear to have shown itself so much earlier in American history? So Lincoln gives no explicit answer to this question in the speech, but I believe that the setting that he's speaking in does give us a good insight into that. He's speaking, if you remember, in the Jacksonian era. And the Jacksonian era is widely known in American history as the era of democratization. In the Jacksonian era, suffrage requirements became more democratic in states all across the Union. The rhetoric of the common man, of his rights, of his dignity, became the order of the day. Political participation through the developed political parties became much more widespread and very activist. And in administration, the spoils system was in place, which gave political offices to people who worked in the party system. So during the Jacksonian era then, the nation moved toward more directly empowering the people than had been the case before. And just as it was an era of democratization, so it was an era of turning against elites. The elites were being portrayed, or often portrayed, I should say, as usurpers of the people's right of self-government. And we see evidence of this sort of thing, movement against elites in a lot of places. Let me just mention one. So the dominant political party, not Lincoln's party, the Whigs, but the other party that Jackson had belonged to, had been called from its founding by, in the time of Jefferson, the Democratic Republican Party, sort of Democratic Republican hyphen party. And in the Jacksonian era, it became shortened just to Democratic, kind of a sign of shorthand democratization of that party. The Whig Party, mostly representing these elites, arose in response to the Jacksonian moment. So with the Jacksonian moment, the idea of the nation as based in popular sovereignty took on a new saliency all around the country, beyond what it had had in the founding era. The political system that the founders had put in place in their new constitution, which we are celebrating today, or in sort of, I should say, a model of what will be September 17th on Monday. I hope everybody will take out their flags and their patriotic ties and all that and celebrate the real day. But in any case, the Constitution that the founders put forward was constituted by a kind of combination of theoretical ideas of popular sovereignty and a particular kind of elitism. And I want to talk a little bit about that combination. So in the defense of the new Constitution that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton put together, the Federalist Papers, which I hope many of you have read or at least heard of, Madison addressed the issue, raised the issue. The whole point of the Federalist Papers was to defend the Constitution in the ratification contest that existed after the Constitutional Convention, and they were writing this document in New York State, where opposition to the Constitution was very strong. And so Madison and Hamilton had to make a strong argument to try to convince the voters of New York to support the Constitution. And one of the issues that Madison raised here was accepting the fact that in order to be agreeable to the American people, the Constitution had to be satisfactorily Republican in character. It had to be a real republic. And in one of these papers, he admitted that the word republic had been understood in many different ways in the course of the history of political thought, but he supplied a definition of it in this context, which was much more democratic than was the normal definition that people accepted and found, that's how they thought about republics. His idea was more democratic. So in Federalist number 39, he defined a republic to be, you have to listen because it's complicated, a government which derives all its powers, directly or indirectly, from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, meaning the pleasure of a superior officer, holding offices for a limited period or during good behavior meaning life tenure unless you do something bad as established in an impeachment proceeding. And that's the definition of republic, just that. The point of this somewhat complex and maybe confusing sounding definition is to insist that in actual governance, the primary sovereignty of the people must be recognized. All governing officers are to be selected by the people or by persons themselves selected by the people. There has to be this link back to the people. Thus, the president, as we probably know, was to be selected by electors who were themselves elected by the people. All governing officers in the administration were to be selected by the president, sometimes alone or sometimes with the Senate, confirmation. Either way, the selection of these lower offices is clearly rather indirect. We have the electors who select the president, who then selects these other people. So we're kind of several steps away from the people, but nonetheless, there's this chain of connection back to the people. It's indirect, but nonetheless, the ultimate source of authority to govern lies with the people. Likewise, all governing individuals are limited in their terms of office, so that they must, in some sense or other, return to the people to be reelected or replaced or whatever, meaning that the people must be regularly consulted about their governors. So popular sovereignty had a robust presence, both theoretical and practical, in the Constitution as brought to us by the framers of it. Now, this constitutional system then was and still is ultimately answerable to the people. But the governors are not the people themselves. The people have a defined and a crucial role to play in governance, but they, and with them, popular sovereignty, recede into the background, except at those moments like elections when they're directly involved. This kind of arrangement was not satisfactory to everyone, and perhaps it isn't satisfactory to everyone even in this room. It sounds a little too remote from democracy as we often think of it. So one of the people who was not satisfied with this way of thinking about democracy or popular sovereignty was the French philosopher Rousseau. Some of you, I hope, have run across Rousseau somewhere in your studies. Rousseau, as you may know, became the teacher of the French revolutionaries, and Rousseau would not settle for an arrangement like American constitutionalism. As he said of the British Constitution and the British nation, often hailed as a model of free government, the British people, he said, thought themselves free, but they were free only on that one day when they voted for their representatives in Parliament. Representation, which in a way is the keystone of the American arch of constitutionalism, was unwelcome, worse than unwelcome, to Rousseau. He considered rule by representatives to be hardly any freer than rule by kings or autocrats. So Rousseau speaking for himself and others later, sought a political arrangement more like what we and the American founders would call a direct democracy, as opposed to the constitutional or representative democracy that the American Constitution embodied. Now, this constitutional system of political institutions was to operate in two main ways. First, there was to be a selection process rooted in the people, according to which the people would use their best judgment about who to put in office. A system of elections was to stand in place of the older democratic way of selecting officers, as practiced, for example, in ancient Athens, that older way being selection by lot. It was thought at the time of the Athenian democracy that this was the proper way in a democracy to select ruling authorities, because the principle of democracy is equality. And the implication, political implication of that is that all people are equally capable of governing. Therefore, the best way to choose the people to govern is by random selection, such as a lot. The American choice to have elections and representation instead of lot was an effort to bring considerations of merit, among other things, into the selection process. Now, the second way in which this system operated is that these governmental officials who were selected by the people were to operate within offices strictly defined by the Constitution and other laws that would both grant them and limit them powers. The Constitution would both grant and limit the powers of the officials, of the officers of the government, and moreover would place each officer into a broader structure of offices where no single people or group had power to make, execute, and adjudicate the law. There was the separation of powers idea being very central to what they were trying to do. Thus, the kind of heated and expansive action taken by mobs would not be possible. Operating according to set rules and procedures, public officials would not act so cruelly as the mob did toward McIntosh, nor so irrationally as the mobs did in Mississippi. So the founders created institutions grounded in and answerable to the people, but emphatically not the people themselves. Not the people, especially operating independently of constitutional forms and formalities. Lincoln and most of the Americans of the 19th century, I should say, looked at the very different outcomes of the American and the French revolutions and the very different results of their respective experiments in a more direct or, on the other side, more representative democracy, and they had no doubt about which model, their own or the French, was superior. So at the same time that the nation understood itself as a popular sovereignty-based republic, it also possessed a set of governmental institutions which, although derived directly or indirectly from the people, just as firmly were not the people themselves. At one place in the Federalist, Madison emphasizes that the people in their, what he called their collective capacity, were wholly excluded from governance, with the exception perhaps of the jury system, which operates more or less like the old Athenian democracy. People are selected more or less by lot to wield real political power, that is, they make real decisions with political effects. But the general thought that the founders possessed here seems to have been something like this. That they were in the complex position of affirming the people as the source of authority, but denying that the people as such were fit instruments for wielding this authority that belonged to them. So the founders made a commitment to be governed by officials acting under the structures and powers of offices as established by the Constitution. The commitment to the Constitution and the shaping of political offices according to the law of the Constitution was what American constitutionalism meant, or still means for that matter. When the people, in Lincoln's case in the form of the mobs, take over, the law tends to be overrun by passions, by anger, by righteous desire to do justice, but also by an inability any longer to judge soberly where justice lies. The structure of constitutional offices puts a damper on passion, gives guidance to action through provisions of law, and imposes checks on the tendency to act impulsively. So direct governmental action by the people was anathema to American constitutionalism, even though the source of governmental power was the same people, the very same people. So for this kind of constitutional system to work properly, the people must accept both the limitations placed upon them and the responsibilities that remain with them. On the one hand, the limitations are that they play their proper role in the system and not step out of that role, but also that they retain responsibility for holding their governors accountable. That is, they have to be active and alert citizens in the role of keeping an eye on their governors. For Lincoln, this translated into a kind of robust self-government, an idea of self-government. He had an idea of an active government. But also, he very much emphasized the need for the people to defer to the law as administered by officials. So one of the major keynote themes of his whole career was reverence for the law, law-abidingness, the need to stay within the law. Now, so Lincoln was witness in the late 1830s to a moment when the dividing line between popular sovereignty and constitutionalism was breaking down. We can label that kind of breakdown populism. That is, the people attempting to exercise governmental power more directly than the systems constitutionalism normally provides for. Now, the Jacksonian era was surely not the only populist moment that we've had in American history. There was another very famous one later in the 19th century, and we are experiencing such a populist moment right now, at least according to the pundits who tell us this pretty much daily. Now, I think Lincoln's analysis helps us to a more precise way to understand and define what this thing populism might be, and it also gives us a way to understand the periodic outbreaks of populism in America and now in other places that share some of the political principles of America. His analysis in the Perpetuation Address, I think, allows us to understand why Lincoln worries over whether such a nation can long endure, a nation like America. On the one side, the success of the regime depends on whether on the people keeping to their proper place, as I've already said. And Lincoln outlines very well what stepping out of that place, what the consequences, the threatening consequences of not doing so are. But on the other side, he leads us to see that there is a constant temptation toward populism in the regime based on popular sovereignty, because looked at philosophically, the way Rousseau did, for example, populism is merely the people taking directly into their own hands what constitutionalism had placed in other hands, but which power, after all, truly belongs to them, to the people. There is therefore a natural tendency for the people periodically to swing toward populism. So what Lincoln is looking at with dismay and ominous foreboding could also be described as a movement toward more democracy, that is, toward direct or participatory democracy. That is the positive way to describe the populist swing, of this people swing toward populism. Now, given the way that populism relates to popular sovereignty, it's not a big surprise when Lincoln, in what otherwise seemed a stunning reversal, provided a kind of justification of the mob law that he had denounced so strongly at first. Recall his comment that abstractly considered the hanging of the gamblers at Vicksburg was of but little consequence. And of McIntosh, he had also expressed a pretty shocking excuse for the mob's actions. Judging solely on what the mob intended in taking the law into its own hands, Lincoln gives us to believe that their action was just and aimed at the public good. Thus, it is clear why these mobs are not the same as the lawless in spirit, that is, those who are law-abiding only from fear of punishment. These mobs act in the name of justice rather than lawlessness. That, I think, is an important takeaway point from Lincoln's speech. The populist mobs are not moved by a desire for self-enrichment, as the normal looting mobs are, or by an aspiration to anarchy or general lawlessness, but by a concern for justice. So Lincoln, to some degree, rehabilitates and even kind of defends these populist activists. But I say to a degree only because, remember, he also reminds us of all of the downside, the bad effects of this kind of populist stepping beyond the bounds of their place in a constitutional system. So being freed from the constraints of law, the mobs, even the good mobs, threaten injustice through the activation of passion and hot judgment rather than the more rational and cool passion encouraged by regular lawful constitutional action. So Lincoln, in effect, overstates his approval of the mob's direct action in order to make his point about the intimate relation between populism and popular sovereignty. See, so Lincoln still leaves us with the important question, why does populism occasionally crash through the boundaries of constitutionalism? What accounts for that moment when this line is crossed? He suggests some causes. The example of mob law to which he pays most attention in his speech is the example of the Mississippi gamblers. As I've suggested, Lincoln himself says this could be understood as a public-spirited action aimed at the common good. But he also tells us that these gamblers and their occupation had been licensed by the state legislature of Mississippi only 1 year before. They were so far forbidden by they are so far from being forbidden by the laws, he says, that they had been licensed by an act of the legislature just a year ago. Lincoln deploys this fact. He deploys this fact in order to emphasize the lawful character of gambling, but he also insinuates something quite different at the same time, and that insinuation is what I want to call attention to now. In licensing the gamblers in Mississippi, the Mississippi legislature, as legislators seem often to do, was greatly out of touch with its constituents, with the people who put them in office. Now, I don't possess much special knowledge of the facts of this case, but I do know three things that I think are relevant to it, and that I think if we think of them, they indicate what the issue is here. First, about the people of Mississippi. The people of Mississippi in the 1830s were, I believe, even more than now, Baptists in their religious commitments. Second, Baptists are strongly opposed to gambling as a moral and theological evil. I have a resolution of the Southern Baptist Convention from as late as 1984, which states the following: whereas gambling is an immoral effort that creates deliberate risks not inherent in or necessary to the functioning of society, be it therefore resolved that we, the messengers of the Southern Baptist Convention, encourage Southern Baptists to work diligently with other Christians and other responsible citizens who oppose the spread of legalized gambling, and that we express our prayerful support and strong encouragement for those who are providing courageous leadership, oh, thank you, in vigorously opposing the legalization of gambling, both at the state and national levels. Now, it's unlikely, I think, I hope you agree, that the Baptists in 1838 were less opposed to gambling than the Baptists of 1984. Third point. When the actions of a legislature go contrary to the clear preferences and sensibilities of their constituents, there is often a special reason for it. In the 19th century, this was known as bribery. In the 20th century, when we at least try to control bribery a little more seriously than they did then, it is often things like campaign contributions or other special benefits that interests who hope to benefit from legislation provide for the legislators. In today's parlance, this kind of thing is called the swamp. The opposition to governing elites who are seen to be benefiting themselves rather than their constituents can be stated in the slogan, "Drain the swamp." So there are moments, in other words, when the people wish to take back their sovereign power, moments when they believe that their constitutional rulers are out of touch with them, with their goals, and their moral sensibilities. These moments are especially severe when the people suspect that their governors have deviated in this way in order to feather their own nests. Lincoln points us, therefore, to the when and the why of the periodic outbursts of populism that punctuate American history. That analysis should lead us to expect that so long as the nation is so conceived and so dedicated that is grounded on human equality and popular sovereignty, we can expect these periodic outbursts of populism. His analysis of the close link between populism and popular sovereignty is probably the most valuable lesson his populist moment has for our populist moment. One implication of that analysis, I believe, is that we should not look at populist outbursts as novel or freak events, as I think most people today are doing. They are, in effect, baked into the three-cornered political order that we have: popular sovereignty, constitutional democracy, and populism. Lincoln's analysis, in this case, is both reassuring and worrisome. On the one hand, so far as populism is endemic to our kind of regime, and so far as we have survived past bouts with it, we can be confident, to some degree at least, that we can survive this one also. But far more overt than the reassuring implications of Lincoln's analysis are his explicit warnings about the dangers inherent in these populist moments. Now, many details of his moment facing populism and of our moment facing populism are obviously very different from each other, but the challenge that populism poses that he identifies, I think, remains constant, if we adjust things, if we adapt his analysis appropriately. Now, the populist disaffection of ordinary good citizens is an outcome always to be deplored, I should say. But it can be a particularly challenging problem to our institutions when it interacts with another potentiality that Lincoln sees lurking within the American political order. As Lincoln puts it, there exist individuals of extraordinary ambition. These are not individuals possessing the kind of ordinary ambition that is satisfied by a seat in Congress or even by the presidency normally. The founders were very aware of the problem that ambition poses for political communities, and they went out of their way to build offices that were powerful enough and distinguished enough that the people of this kind of ambition, well, let's call it ordinary, but still high ambition, would be satisfied by the offices available to them in the constitutional order that they had built. Alexander Hamilton, in his papers on the presidency in the Federalist, gives an extremely good analysis of this aspect of what the founders were doing. Big offices which will satisfy people of ambition. If we satisfy these people within the boundaries of the Constitution, then they are no danger to the Constitution because they find their satisfaction in it. But Lincoln is talking about more ambitious people than that. Lincoln claims the people he has in mind now belong to the family of the lion and the tribe of the eagle. And these people are not satisfied with positions in a political order created by others. As Lincoln says, towering genius disdains a beaten path. These men see no distinction in adding story to story upon the monuments of fame erected to the memory of others. They do not seek fame within the constitutional order established by the Washingtons, the Madisons, the Jeffersons of the founding era, but they seek to supplant the founders' political orders and set up new ones of their own. They seek to be the new Washington, the father of his country, or the new Madison, the father of the new some new political order. Nothing suits the aims of these extraordinarily ambitious, lion-like, eagle-like people than the populist emergence of a disaffected citizenry. The citizenry whose grievances and aspirations they happily serve in order to serve their own. As Lincoln said, these eagles and lions thirst and burn for distinction, and if possible, will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men. An example appropriate, obviously, to Lincoln's day, not so clearly appropriate to our day, but there are parallels. In the combination of the disaffected citizenry and the individuals of lion-like ambition lies, Lincoln argues, the most potent danger to our political institutions, because the greatly ambitious individual has a will to overturn the established order, and the disaffected populist citizenry is willing to sign on for the attempt. So as we attempt to assess the present populist moment, we must ask, don't laugh, is Donald Trump the sort of towering genius that Lincoln warned against? The type of individual who can take advantage of populist disaffection and pose a genuine threat to our established constitutional institutions. Now, we have to note at the outset that Lincoln does not mean by towering genius what we probably would mean when we use this phrase. He does not mean a man of towering intellect like an Einstein, but a man of great spirit or great ambition, extraordinarily great ambition. Judging from his own comments, perhaps President Trump has such ambition. He already declared himself the greatest president next to Lincoln. He seems to aspire to even more. Does this mean he aspires to bring new constitutional orders or political orders to burnish his own fame at the expense of the constitutional order? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. President Trump, we should say, pursues policies that are controversial and distasteful to many and welcome to many others. This disagreement on policy, in my opinion, is a normal part of our democratic political life and should not be grounds for special concern beyond the political give and take that is part of normal and ordinary politics. Let there be robust debate on policies. Let us recognize that real disagreements over policy can be intense and very important to the participants. But let us distinguish these from other kinds of matters, for there are certain aspects of the Trump presidency that Lincoln's analysis and prescriptions warn us to take more seriously. I refer to various well-known things that he says and does. He attempts on a very regular basis to discredit the press as the enemy of the people. But as Thomas Jefferson said of the press, which by the way was both very partisan in his day and also very vicious towards him personally in his day. As Jefferson said, where the press is free and every man able to read what's in it, all is safe. The president, our present president, regularly tries to discredit the agents of rule of law in our society, the Justice Department, the FBI, intelligence agencies, and so on. He regularly speaks and acts as if it is the purpose of these institutions to support and protect him personally, and is quite angry when they do not do as he wishes. What is most troubling, I believe, what Lincoln would believe, beside his apparent misunderstanding of his office, is the pass that his supporters and his party give him on these aspects of his actions. Presumably, they do so in order to protect him, to pursue the policies his supporters and his party favor. But Lincoln would urge us to distinguish Trump's policies from his threats to the Constitution and the rule of law. President Trump does indeed look at times, certainly at times, like the man of great ambition, trying to whip up his populist base to go beyond or outside the constitutional order. Lincoln would tell us, I believe, he would tell us this. This is his advice from beyond the grave, as we like to say. Agree to disagree about Trump and his policies, but at the same time, agree to agree about the value of the constitutional order, which, whatever its flaws, has brought more civil and religious liberty over time than any other in world history. Do not cut him slack, do not make excuses for him, do not seek partisan advantages by countenancing moves he makes that threaten the Constitution and the fundamentals of the constitutional order. If we remain true to the Constitution and to the rule of law it provides, we will get through this populist moment just fine. Perhaps we can even reap some of the potential benefits of populist outbursts. In any case, Constitution Day, I believe, is the perfect time to recognize and reaffirm the value not merely of our Constitution, but of the very cause of constitutionalism. Thank you. What are you going to do? I have questions? Okay. Nobody has any? Does that mean you're all persuaded? No, there's some in the back. Okay, nobody wants.
What happens to our constitutionalism when our highest courts, our Supreme Courts and our appeals courts are offset, are one-sided with conservatives? How does that affect our constitutionalism? How can we be...
When our courts are one-sided, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if we elect all conservatives to say our Supreme Court, if it's overloaded with conservatives, what happens then?
Well, I mean, I think the real issue is not so much whether it's overloaded with conservatives, but whether it's become so partisan that it just looks like another political part of, another part of the political system, that it's not really any different from a political party that clearly has a partisan position. That, I think, is the real danger to constitutionalism. Lincoln, in a way, faced this problem in his own, not in his presidency, but in the pre-presidency years, because in those years, I don't know, I'll give a little bit of background, but it gets complicated. So in those years, the later years of the 1850s, the big issue on the table at that time was the question of the spreading of slavery into the territories. So, the U.S. owned a lot of territory at that time, including the state of Montana, which was not organized yet into being a state. And the policy that the country had followed more or less up to that time was the policy contained in the Missouri Compromise, which was slavery would be allowed into certain parts of that territory and forbidden in other parts. And what Lincoln and his party wanted to do was to tighten that policy up a little bit by not allowing or forbidding the spread of slavery altogether. So that was their side of the issue. And then on the other side of the issue was the the Southern position, which wanted to open up all the territories to slavery. So you had two clear positions: close the territories to slavery or open the territories to slavery. So what happened, as is not so uncommon in American history, is that Congress kind of punted on the question and wanted the court to settle it. And so, but by this time, the Supreme Court was, for reasons that one could explain, but the Supreme Court was heavily biased towards the South. Most of the justices either came from the South or sympathized with the South. And so a very famous case came to the Supreme Court in 1857 called the Dred Scott versus Sandford case. And in this case, one of the questions that arose was the Missouri Compromise constitutional? And the court held that it was not constitutional. And it held this by saying, or it argued that Congress had no power to forbid slavery in the territories. And it gave a complicated reason for that, but it was a very contested, a very how should we say, there was a lot of conflict about this decision, as you might guess. People in the South loved it, they thought it was great, et cetera, and others found it less attractive. And Lincoln himself was one of those who spoke out against the Dred Scott decision. And what he tried to do was to find a way to make the court less politically potent than it was trying to be. So what the court in this case did, in effect, was it said that the main policy goals of one of the two main political parties in the US was unconstitutional. That the Republican Party of Lincoln might just as well go home and forget about running for office because the policy they wanted to enact was unconstitutional, so forget it. And what Lincoln wanted to do was to find a way of talking about the court and what it does that would lead to a less decisive role for the court in political matters like this, trying to settle the biggest question facing the country. Courts aren't up to that. That's too big for courts to do. It's a sign of how unsettled things are now, that the Supreme Court appointments figure so largely in presidential elections. This shouldn't be. The Supreme Court should not be a major issue in presidential elections. But because of the role the court plays, it's obvious that it is, and there's reason for it. So I think Lincoln would agree that the partisanship of courts is a problem. It's a problem in part because we all lose confidence in the courts as objective and neutral and actually trying to find the real constitutional solution, but they look like just other political players. And that's very bad for, that's very bad for the courts, very bad for keeping any kind of authority to what they decide. So Lincoln would admit, yes, this is a very serious constitutional problem, and he tried his best to formulate a way of thinking about the court that would blunt the impact of that a bit. Yeah, good. Yeah.
You mentioned Germany, the devastating economic circumstances of that country in the 15 years following World War I provided the circumstances from which populism could permit sort of de facto dictatorship to evolve. Do you see our own Constitution as having sufficient protections against that sort of evolution, or are there aspects of this we ought to pay attention to?
Well, here's in a way, my point in my talk was to say, yes, if we actually enforce, if we actually hold to the Constitution as it is, it does. Because the Constitution builds in, some rules of law that would set limits to what people can do under it. And it has a separation of powers which can be appealed to in such cases. But what we're seeing more and more is on the one hand, a willingness of political forces in the country to use the Constitution as a partisan tool rather than saying, well, look, there's some lines, even, we want policy X, but there's some things we're not going to go along with. We're not going to go along with destroying the Constitution in order to get policy X. And so what I believe the lesson that Lincoln has for us here is those parts of the Constitution that stand as the support for the abiding existence of this nation as what we would call a democratic nation. The founders would call a republican nation, but the terminology doesn't make that much difference. That these are the things we need to actually hold on to and not put them at risk because we want some policy outcome, or in the case of our current president, sometimes he seems to threaten the foundations of the constitutional order. You know, if he gets people, I don't know how everybody in this room feels, but if you come to the point where you never believe anything that the so-called mainstream media tell you, well, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. Yeah.
Well, what's your greatest worry?
Well, I don't know. I have a hard time putting them in rank order, you know. I mean, I worry. I mean, the question raised about the courts, I worry about that. I think that, you know, the courts somehow need to heal themselves or get healed somehow. I worry about the Republican majority in Congress not doing its job of protecting the Constitution. I worry. I mean, I don't. You know, we get controversial here. I worry about the EPA and what it's doing or not doing. You know, I got a pretty long list actually, but not all of them is relevant to what we're talking about tonight. Because I think, you know, as I said, I think we can all disagree about some of the policy questions, and you know, I may feel strongly about them. You may feel strongly on the other side, but I don't see those as things to really worry about. We have a political process that gets us through that, more or less. Yeah.
Historically speaking, do you see a common factor that ends a populist movement?
That's a good question. It's easier to kind of look at how they come into being than how they go away. Let me, you know, I haven't really thought about that so much. So Jacksonian populism, what happens? I mean, I think partly, at least in the case of American history, sometimes the populist goals get absorbed by the rest of the system. That's one of the things that tends to happen. Partly, it's both a blessing and a curse of American politics that people get bored with whatever's going on after a while, and so they start doing something else. So there's that. But I'm sure there are better answers than I've just given you to that question, but I don't possess one right now. So
Lincoln, you mentioned how Lincoln said this too shall pass.
Yes.
But I just wondered if
Yeah, I mean, I guess I hold to the belief that we have a good Constitution, and that if we just honor it and you know, play it the way it is, we'll get through this. Yeah. How about some of the students? Nobody? Come on, students. Yeah, okay, there we go.
How do you believe, in this whole context, the notion that the possibility that a sitting president cannot be indicted for crimes, for major crimes, how does that play into this whole notion of upholding our laws?
Yeah, an excellent question. I mean, on this issue, you know, we don't have much established law or much really, I mean, there are sort of policy positions out there. Justice Department has a sort of rule of thumb policy on this question. I don't think it's a question that's gotten really, really hardcore, serious thinking. My thinking on it is actually this, that the founders put impeachment into the Constitution as the device that was to be used in situations like that. You have a problem with the president, impeachment is the solution, and not. I mean, I would be wary about indicting a sitting president or anything like that. The founders, I think, saw impeachment as a more potent tool than we've managed to use it to be. So every time, we've only impeached president twice, and we've not convicted them either time, and it's sort of fallen aside. But But the founders thought it would be, more usable, I think. And maybe we should, too much impeachment is bad. I mean, I've always thought the founders had a good idea about impeachment, which is so impeachment, on the one hand, they have constructed this office that at the time was compared to an elective monarchy. I mean, it was really a strong office, this presidency, with a lot of independence, and keeping it independent is an important part of what makes it a good office. On the other hand, it's a strong office and therefore, dangerous office. There are things that presidents can do that would be misconduct and can be quite problematic and dangerous. So the founders try to find a political solution to this problem, not by writing some set of guidelines, but a political solution to the problem. How do we both control the president, but not over-control the president? How do we control the president when he needs control, but not control him when he doesn't? That sort of thing. And so they came up with this idea that the House would, in effect, indict the president, impeach him, and then the Senate would be the body that would judge the impeachment, that's convict him or not. And this seemed to me a rather smart idea, because every senator, more or less, aspires to be president. And so as the Senate, as a separate branch of government, has a stake in, let ambition counter ambition, as James Madison wrote in Federalist Number 51, has a stake. The Senate, as a separate institution, has a stake in keeping an eye on the president and opposing the president sometimes. But every senator wants to be president and has an eye on not castrating that office, keeping that office a good office, strong. So that I think the combination of motives that senators have is a good combination, because it leads them to not be frivolous or merely political in exercising the power to finally impeach, convict a president, versus being too soft on him. So I think it's a smart move, because they're depending upon human nature operating as it operates to produce. They would hope a pretty good outcome by unleashing the way ambition in human beings works. That they had a very astute sense of that. So that's, I think, the way they would settle that question. That's I guess the way I would tend to as well, even though I'm tempted to want to indict him. Yeah.
What role did populism play in the amending of the Constitution?
Well, it's very difficult to amend the Constitution, as you may have discovered. It depends a little bit on how. Here, there's a question of how large a populist movement would be. Could we have a populist movement that would be large enough to amend the Constitution on a controversial issue? And I think that's a contingent question. I mean, we don't know. Sometimes we might, sometimes we might not. So far, I don't see any movement. I don't see a majority large enough to amend the Constitution, anything important right now. So I guess I would have to say that it depends, what role populism would play. Yeah. Yes.
Do you think there's a way to put the power back into Congress to make the laws and take it out of these unelected officials that make up the laws and then judge the person and sentence them?
Well, I mean, the fact is, nobody has taken power away from Congress. Congress has resigned to some of its powers, and I suppose the only solution is Congress stepping up and doing its part. And it's often there are reasons why people in Congress defer decisions to other people, including bureaucrats, but also sometimes the president. And Congress, finally it's on us. It's on us, the people who elect Congress, to hold them to their responsibilities. So, you know, that's a sort of twist on this issue that Lincoln didn't catch, or that wasn't there in his day. That is, that sometimes we, the people, have to not merely kind of step back and be restrained in our action, but we sometimes have to push those guys to do their job too. And I think that's the answer. I mean, that the people have to push harder at Congress to do its job, hold them responsible for doing their job. I mean, right now, so a lot of people complain about, you know, decisions being made by EPA or by whatever agency you want to talk about. But the reason they do, a lot of congressmen complain about it, but Congress delegated that authority. I mean, wasn't it stolen? Yeah.
To the extent that populism depends upon degree of education, degree of information, degree of press, and so forth, how would you compare today's era with any prior historic eras?
I think that's really hard to do because just as you say, there's so many factors that are at work. So for example, you know, a big issue, social media today. So back in Lincoln's day, or back even more in the Founders' day, when Madison is concerned, some of you may have read Madison's Federalist Number 10, a very famous argument that Madison put forward in the Federalist Papers. And one of the things he was counting on to prevent the formation of tyrannical majorities was that in this fairly large country that we have, it's going to be very difficult for like-minded people to find each other. And so forming these kind of majorities that have bad intentions is going to be hard. Just forming the majority will be difficult because communication across this huge place is hard. But now we have social media, which make it much easier for, you know, like-minded people to find each other, and that changes the situation. I mean, I think the way things have played out now are, you know, different than any, you know, because of the social media and related matters, different than they ever would have been. So I don't feel, you know, I guess I'm reduced to saying the same thing I said to the other. It's very contingent on what's going on at the moment. I think Lincoln helps us see some of the abiding features of the populist situation, but to deal with the specific situation is too contingent depending on what's out there at the moment, things like that. So, yeah.
On these questions of executive, usurping the Congress's responsibilities, and also your concern that perhaps Congress is not standing up to the ambitious president.
Yeah.
Both of those issues remind me that whereas the legislative is supposed to be the check on the president, in fact, the check on the president really is the other political party. And parties aren't part of the structure of the Constitution,
Right.
of course.
Yes.
And it makes me sometimes wonder whether isn't a parliamentary democracy where that's on the table, that the legislative, and there's no check by the legislature on the executive. The check, you throw a lot of them out in an election.
Yeah.
Are you sometimes, I'm sometimes tempted by the idea that a parliamentary democracy works better.
Well, I'm not sure that the empirics of that support that. You know, the parliamentary democracies have had their problems, and I think the U.S. constitutional system. You know, it's easy to get kind of caught up in the places where it doesn't seem to be working that well, but look what the U.S. constitutional system has produced over time. I mean, you know, the U.S. produced unparalleled wealth, liberty. We won World War II. We won the Cold War. I mean, these are things that the constitutional system made possible.
You could point to other reasons for that in terms of, you know, our resources that are continent-wide.
Yeah. But I mean, again, yeah, those are not.
In England a couple of years, you know, a few decades ago.
Yeah.
It was remarkable to see, and almost refreshing sometimes to see the efficiency is something to get done, which is not the case here, where we, you know, we're on, nothing happens on, say, an immigration issue, decade after decade. Because
Yeah. Well, see, immigration is a good case in point, it seems to me, where the fact is, for so long, the parties, they all agree something should be done about immigration. But the fact is, the parties didn't really have a big incentive to do something about immigration because foreign workers coming in turned out to be something that nobody wanted to squash. And so they followed for years after years, very conflicting and contradictory policy on immigration. And that I don't blame on either the Constitution or on, you know, whether a parliamentary or a non-parliamentary system.
I'm blaming some of the inefficiency of government, or the inefficiency of Congress on the system we have as opposed to the system where the executive and legislature are
united. Well, I mean, you know, this is obviously a big debate or a big issue within political science. You could spend a long time debating that question. I mean, personally, a consideration that weighs very heavily in my mind is that a parliamentary system tends to be very executive oriented. It's very the prime minister and the executive leads the parliament. The parliament has a choice. You go along or you destroy the government. That's it. I mean, you don't have other choices in between. I think a system in which there's more input from the people, from the states, from congressmen, committees, et cetera, is a better system that works than what works top down like that. But obviously, top down systems have their efficiencies that our kind of system doesn't. And so, at a certain point, you have to recognize there's just no solution that has every ideal factor as part of it. So you pay a price for every solution, and no solution is perfect. I think this one we have is a better idea on the whole, but one can see the advantages of the other. There's one more hand back there. I think a student. Let's get him. Is he gone? Has he gotten shy all of a sudden? I thought there was somebody. Yeah. Okay.
So. If we look at the majority of the electorate is voted, and it's about half the population that could vote. And so we see the populist movement being 26% of the electorate.
Right.
How do we empower change in Congress as a check on democracy when the populist movement is apathy?
When the populist movement is what was the last one?
Apathy, or like disaffected, doesn't vote.
Oh, well, I'm going to be interested to see what turnout is like at this midterm election, because I get the sense that people are actually kind of more worked up than normal. And we'll see on both parties, I think. I think we're going to see a pretty big turnout on both parties. So part of we come back to the fact that a lot of the problems we face are due to failures in the electorate, not failures so much in the Constitution. Now, you might say that failures in the electorate are related to the fact that we have a very large country, we have a very complicated country. It's hard to be a good citizen in America today. It's hard to be a good citizen because it's hard to be properly informed about the issues. It's hard to, there's just so much going on to keep track of. So there are all those considerations, and we have, the issues about campaign finance, those kind of issues which get in the mix as well. We get the issue of the transformation of politics into basically an adjunct of the television business. That's an important factor. Maybe we need to think hard about trying to make the country more hospitable to citizenship. And one of the things we political scientists try to do, a little bit anyways, hope to educate people to see the importance of some of these things. Thank you.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you.